really happy to be here. And by the way, I wore this green shirt on purpose. My 7-year-old told me I needed to wear it so I wouldn't get pinched today, and so far his strategy's working. So, I'd like to begin by thanking the faculty and staff of the lab where I work at. These people make what I do possible. I'm a physician researcher. I have what I think are good ideas sometimes, but I need the help of others to execute those ideas. I don't have the background in biostats and machine learning and things that are required to do the work that I'm going to present. So I'm going to talk about some of the motivation of our lab, what started the lab off, and kind of where we're going with it. So really what I see as the two biggest problems in orthopedic care are that, number one, when I sit down with a patient and really discuss in depth their medical choices, we lack the ability to discuss the implications of those choices because we don't share a common language. And second, the science in orthopedics in particular is limited by a reliance on subjective outcomes. And those subjective outcomes have major limitations with ceiling and floor effects. They lack a lot of precision. We can't iterate in the science and make 5% improvements over multiple iterations in time because the precision is just not there with these outcomes measures. And these two issues are interrelated, and I'm going to talk about that. So I want to play this video for you because I think it illustrates really well the first problem.
Hey everyone, I thought I would make this video because it has taken me a really long time to finally come to the conclusion that I wanted to have surgery for my herniated disc. And I feel like if I had really had, you know, support or people around sharing their experience, it probably would have assisted me in making my decision more quickly, not having to wait so long and suffer as long as I have. So I thought, hey, maybe if this helps someone, great.
All right, well, I'm glad she made that video because it helps me, hopefully to help people like her in the future and help all of us understand this issue. So let me just hypothetically talk around this because this patient obviously was very interested in getting the right care, but she didn't really know what to expect. She wanted to know, how can I make a choice about surgery without really knowing what happens to people when this occurs? And putting myself in the physician role, I'll explain a hypothetical. But before that, I'll just tell you something that I know and probably very few of you know, and that is that a herniated disc is one of the things that we know the most about in orthopedics. We know the natural history, we know what to expect over time, we know the success rates of surgery and all this stuff. We know a lot about it, more than almost any other thing in orthopedics. But I'm assuming she saw a physician who knew that and tried to explain that to her in a meaningful way. And so let's just hypothetically go through how that process might occur. So she's in my clinic and she says, you know, I think I might need to do surgery for this. And I say, yeah, I think it's time to consider surgery. And she says, well, what can I expect? And I say, well, with your MRI findings and your physical exam findings, your history, you have about a 90 to 95% chance of success with surgery. And the conversation often ends there, but she seems smart. And so she asks, well, okay, that sounds like a good percentage, but what do you mean by success? And I say, oh, well, that's a good question. Success means that you exceed the minimum clinically important difference in our two main outcomes, which are your pain and your function. And she says, okay, what's minimum clinically important difference? And I say, well, for pain, we rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, and if there's a 2 to 3 point change in your pain, then we consider that the minimum important difference. She says, okay, so my pain's going to go from an 8 to a 6, and you call that a success? Yes. All right, she understands that part, and she says, what about this function piece? And I say, well, we have a questionnaire called the ODI, and you completed that questionnaire, and if that questionnaire changes by 30%, then that's the minimum clinically important difference. And then I've totally lost her. What's the ODI? What does this mean? And so I can't really talk to her about what her choices mean and what she can expect, because the things that I know don't translate into her world. So the problem, too, is that we have these subjective outcomes, and the ODI is one of them, and they're useful research tools. It's important to know what people think about how they feel, but they're not quantitative, they're not precise, and so there's been a call in the orthopedics world for measurements that can help us solve that problem, to give us precise measures of function. And there's a good exception that proves my point here. So I'm a spine consultant for the San Francisco 49ers and some of the other professional teams in the Bay Area. And this group of individuals is the one group that I can actually have a meaningful conversation with. Because if one of the 49ers comes to my clinic with a disc herniation, and we decide it's time for them to consider surgery, I can tell them you have a 75% chance of success. Now, it's lower than the success I told you before, right? But what does success mean for that professional football player? It means returning to the same performance metrics on the field as before they herniated their disc. So if they're a running back, they'll have this 75% chance of going back to the same average yards per carry. If they're a linebacker, the same tackles per game. And so we can tell them that because this group of people has regular performance measurements. And research can therefore say what's the likelihood that they'll return to their prior level of performance. So these tools, well, before I get to the wearable application, I want to explain a little bit around human function. So what I just talked about for those football players is their performance on the field. And the ICF defines human function in two areas. There's capacity, which is our ability to do things in a controlled environment. How much can the football player bench press? How fast can they run a 100-yard dash? And then there's performance. How do they actually do on the field? And as you know, how much you bench press and how fast you run relates somewhat to how you do on the field, but it really doesn't predict your performance. And performance is a thing that patients care about. They want to know, can I get on the floor and play with my kids? Can I get to the mailbox and back without having to stop and sit down? They're really worried about their physical performance in their daily life. So the tools that we're all familiar with seem a logical way of getting performance measurements on people. But I'll tell you a surprising fact. I care about this stuff. I do research on wearables. And yet if a patient comes into my clinic tomorrow with their step count from their device or their calorie count from their device and wants me to look at it and interpret it for them in the clinical context of their disease, I won't, because it's meaningless to me. The information from these devices is really useless in the orthopedics clinic. And so that's the motivation for where we're going in my lab, and I'll explain how we're solving some of these problems. This is a typical study that you'll see in the orthopedics world, where they looked at people after replacement of arthritic hip or knee. And I was talking to somebody earlier about how wonderful people describe the outcomes after they have these joint replacements. They say, oh, it changed my life. But you put a pedometer on them or an activity tracker on them, and they look the same as they were before they had surgery. So why is that the case? Why are we not seeing differences when clearly these people tell us that there's a major change in their life? Well, I'm going to try to describe it simply, but the bottom line is the analysis applied to the data coming from the tracker is wrong. The current validated systems are built to look at oxygen consumption and energy expenditure. And that's very useful for diseases where that's a major mechanism. But for orthopedics diseases, people just want to get around better. They're not looking to run a marathon or to be highly physically active. And as a result, the current system that analyzes these things focuses the analysis on higher levels of energy expenditure. And that are these things in the vigorous and the moderate range of activity. However, the average American spends about 90% of their non-sedentary time in this yellow bar, this light range of activity. That's where we live our lives. And the person with an orthopedics disease, it's 95% or more of their activity is just within this little bar. And if you measure total daily counts from a monitor or calories expended from the monitor, your preference is for this, what's happening up here, and you're washing out anything that happens down here. And so what we're calling physical performance monitoring, which is really focused on what happens in this light activity range, is different than physical activity monitoring, which cares about the high end of the spectrum and sedentary time. And we prove that by taking a new look at the data from these monitors. To do that, we first had to understand how a person's health experience impacts their physical activity so we can control for all of the big influences on activity like age, obesity, gender, and on and on. And controlling for all those things, we were able to see the impact of pain on a person's function through accelerometry. And by doing so, we derived new intervals that are specifically tuned to seeing the impact of pain on a person's physical behaviors. And I've turned that scale on its side here. This bottom line of the graph shows the usual intervals, the Friedson intervals, which are highly validated and very useful for looking at energy expenditure, and overlaid the new intervals that we derived to show the impact of pain. And you can see that when we look to see where do we have to segment the activity spectrum to see the influence of pain, there's a separation of the light activity range into 3 separate intervals that are useful in reviewing the impact of pain. So applying this tool, we were able to discover new insights into mechanisms of disease. Researchers before had tried to understand how physical activity might influence the link between back pain and obesity, but nobody had been able to do it with questionnaire-based tools. But applying this tool and accelerometry analysis, we're able to show how physical activity moderates that relationship. We're also starting to discover new insights into clinical outcomes. When we applied this tool to people who had a surgical treatment for lumbar spinal stenosis, we saw that the monitor actually was more responsive to change after surgery than the typical self-reported measures. And we're also developing new insights into disease management. So applying this new tool and looking multidimensionally at those intervals in an approach that tries to understand choices and behaviors in physical activity through the day rather than quantifying energy expenditure, we're able to extract features that helped us identify and characterize people with knee osteoarthritis and accurately characterize and classify them from a normal population with 80% accuracy, or I'm sorry, 83% accuracy for the knee osteoarthritis. For people with lumbar spinal stenosis with 80% accuracy, we can classify them from the normal population. And most surprising to me, when we took the populations of people with lumbar stenosis, which is a common spine disorder that limits mobility, and knee osteoarthritis, and extracted features that could distinguish between those two, we were able to do that with 72% precision, which is what I was hoping for, but honestly didn't believe we'd be able to do with information from these monitors. But by applying the tool I showed you earlier, we're able to do it with this level of precision. And just to show you, to give you a snapshot of where these features are coming that allow us to characterize these populations, if you take the top 4 features that help classify disease populations from normals, or that distinguish the 2 disease populations from one another, you can see that there's a few that are represented in the sedentary range of activity and a few up in the moderate and vigorous range of activity. But the majority of features that helped us distinguish these patients from controls or the patients from one another are in this light activity range. So, what have we learned by going down this path? Well, we learned that the analysis of biosensor data has to match the clinical condition. And we learned that by taking a step back and saying this just doesn't make sense, that activity monitors don't show us a problem here in people with knee arthritis or spinal stenosis or other common mobility limiting disorders. And so by refocusing and looking in a way that has clinical importance, we were able to find signals that matter. We also see a path towards a solution to problem 1. With these kind of tools, we can now have performance measurements on regular people in their regular lives, and we can do for regular people what we do for NFL players. Because right now, if I want to have that meaningful conversation, I either have to build a new tool that shows performance measurements for normal people, or I have to find a way to make all of my patients play for the NFL, which I don't think is going to happen. We see a solution to problem 2. This provides a tool that's objective, it's quantifiable, it's not limited by the same limitations that come from our patient-reported outcome measures. And then from this, we're developing what we're calling performance phenotypes, where we're phenotyping specific disorders by extracting the features that matter to these disorders. And we see these performance phenotypes as a platform for development of precision health tools. We can now start to apply this to look and see when should a patient with knee arthritis have surgery for that knee, instead of a completely subjective decision between the patient and the physician. We can actually quantify when it's optimal to do that. We can build treatment response tracking tools that will help us identify when people aren't responding as expected and get them back into the healthcare environment or to physical therapy earlier, get them the care they need, instead of waiting for them to come for their 2-month follow-up and finding out much later that there's a problem. So we're excited about this technology. I'm interested in talking to anybody that has a mobility limited population that they specialize in that wants to look at applying these tools. We're looking broadly at using this, and thank you very much.